want to welcome you to this presentation, Strategies and Resources for Faith Communities Seeking to Support Veterans and Active Duty Military Families. I'm Nancy Ramsay, Director of the Soul Repair Center at Brite Divinity School on the campus of TCU in Fort Worth, Texas. The center provides resources for religious leaders and professional caregivers who support veterans and their families affected by moral injury. Our mission includes offering free monthly webinars that further that mission with a focus on topics that have been inadequately covered or not yet addressed. We are grateful for the support of the Shea Center on Moral Injury at Volunteers of America, which co-sponsors these webinars. This webinar will include opportunities to learn more about existing organizational resources and practices for supporting veterans and their families, with particular attention to those that relate to faith communities. We will learn how these organizations provide attention to ongoing impacts of moral injury in its various forms. We'll also explore ways these practices of care are provided in a particular congregation of Holman UMC in Los Angeles, and its ministry includes both ongoing support for veterans and their families, as well as specialized ministry supporting women veterans affected by military sexual trauma. Our format will include presentations by our presenter and conversations between us, which will join in the latter part of the initial presentations around 3 p.m. We'll give close attention to the questions that you send in the chat. The leadership for this panel includes Captain Lyman Smith, U.S. Navy retired, a ministerial member of the Presbyterian Church USA. He recently retired as the executive director and endorsing official of Presbyterian Federal Chaplaincies and previously served as the executive director of the Military Chaplains Association. While serving with the Military Chaplains Association, Chaplain Smith helped to develop the Veteran Military Friendly Congregation Ministry, which continues to support congregations today and which we will have an opportunity to explore in detail. Unfortunately, the Reverend Louis Tillman, associate pastor at Holman United Methodist Church in Los Angeles, who previously served in the United States Air Force Reserves and served as a chaplain at Hampton Veterans Affairs Medical Center, will not be with us during this webinar. He is with a family member whom the family learned yesterday would need surgery at this hour. I invite you to keep his family in your prayers. I do invite you to go to the website of Holman to find the link to their ministry Beyond the Battlefield. This is a ministry of accompaniment with the women veterans in their journey to heal from the emotional and relational wounds of war. This ministry seeks to encourage the women veterans and facilitate right relationships for military families. Fortunately, Chaplain Smith had time to revise his presentation, and we have developed a conversational strategy for the two of us in today's presentation. Our chat monitor is Reverend Kyle Fauntleroy, a Director of Development at Brite, a founding member of the Soul Repair Center's National Advisory Board, and a retired captain in the United States Navy Chaplain Corps. He will forward your questions in the chat to me to pose to the presenter in the final 30 minutes of our webinar. We deeply appreciate the production expertise of Sam McAllister at Volunteers of America. The link to this webinar will be available in 10 days to 2 weeks, and it will be on this center's website and at VOA. Please remember that all of our webinars are posted as links on this website and at the VOA YouTube channel. I also want to alert you that in 2 weeks from today, we will look forward to bringing a webinar featuring the United States Air Force Chaplain School and their recent inclusion of diversity, equity, and inclusion training for all chaplains, as well as annual renewal of that area of expertise. I look forward to that webinar, and I hope you'll join us. And now I want to invite our attention to the presentation by Chaplain Lyman Smith.
Fantastic. Thank you, Nancy. It is a pleasure to be with all of you. As I look at the names of some of the attendees, I see names that I'm familiar with. Welcome. Some that I'm not. And so I pray that this is going to be of use to you. And I want to pre-say that a lot of what we're talking about, I have designed to apply very specifically for congregational ministry. and that's congregational ministry across the board, and how it is that communities of faith in our nation are able to reach out and be a major part of how we take care of our veterans, our military members, and their families. And we don't want to leave that out. The family support is incredibly important as we see an increasingly diversified military, as well as military members who are leaving families behind because it's impossible for them to go with them. And so congregations, communities of faith are extremely important in taking care of those who serve our nation. As I start out, I want to talk a little bit about what our veterans are and whether or not they're really different from the rest of the population. And so first thing I want to say, veterans are not broken people. Sometimes we get the impression that veterans come back and they're wasted and they're drug addicts, they're alcoholics or whatever. Veterans are not. They're great citizens. And the vast majority of them are going to do very, very well following their military service. The fact that they do very well doesn't necessarily mean that there are not changes that have occurred, as there are. And some of those changes may be trauma, they may be injury, they may be things that are not readily apparent on the outside. And it's very important then to give them that opportunity to be part of a community in which they can be accepted. But don't think that they're broken simply because they've served. I think that we had more veterans running for national office this year than we've seen in a long time. In fact, I saw that there are 4 members of one class from West Point, all of whom have been elected, who are serving on both sides of the aisle. We're seeing veterans continue to be a major part of the leadership of our nation, and we always want to remember that. But what we also want to remember is that veterans do have ongoing spiritual, mental, and behavioral issues related to their service. Even if they're not evident, it could be that they're underlying. It could be things they don't want to talk about. And we're going to talk about that more. The other thing is, never forget that family members are part of that dynamic. When we saw such a major mobilization of reserves and National Guard folks in terms of supporting the wars that we were in for 20 plus years, it was a major hit on families because we found that families were living in parts of the United States that did not have access to the same resources that active duty family members did. And that continues to be the case today. And as I said, as we see more dual professional families in the nation, we see that spouses sometimes are not able to go and be with a spouse simply because of the family dynamic. Families and local congregations who are married to military members, extremely important to know who they are, that they can be supported. Another one is being in combat. Combat is not a distinctive discriminator. I'm going to talk a little bit about suicide among veterans, but the suicide rate, when you dig into the statistics, is not necessarily related to combat service. And so when we think about veterans, even though they may not have served in Iraq, Afghanistan, other places around the world, the impact of their service is nevertheless there. Training accidents are real. People are killed. There was an incident at Fort Indiantown Gap just a couple of weeks ago in a training accident. 2 individuals lost their lives. That means there are an entire set of families that are now affected by that. And they were doing nothing but driving trucks in a remote area of Indiantown Gap in Pennsylvania. The military culture varies significantly from our civilian life. And so we must remember that when military members, those who have been in for some time, come back, it is a transition to go away from the close bonds that they have had, from recognizing that their compatriots are going to be supportive of them, to living sometimes in a very isolated society in which there's a lot of division. And that can take some time to get used to. There was one retired Air Force colonel that I was on a video chat with just a week or so ago. Very well-adjusted, doing a great job. Somebody said, "Hey, are you really still living like you did?" And he said, "Oh yeah, my wife reminded me just the other day, I never get into my car without walking around it." He was completely unaware, but it's something that remains. Suicide rates among veterans. There are a number of different ways that we can look at them, parse them out, so on and so forth. But the reality is veterans have a much higher suicide rate than what the general population does. By some estimates, good estimates, males are more than 50% more likely to take their lives than the general population, and females, and very, very tragic, 2.5 times more likely to commit suicide than what it is for the general population. And the figures that we have don't necessarily represent the entirety of that tragedy, because sometimes accidents and homicides that are not counted as suicides are still related to that individual service. Veterans who have served since September 11, 2001 are dying via suicide at twice the rate of Americans overall. And those who serve that are older from previous conflicts are actually dying faster because of homicides. And again, it's statistically there. We need to be aware of it and do what we can in order to support it. But with all that negativity, the other thing I want to emphasize is veterans love to help. Veterans in worship communities need to be incorporated in terms of how can they give back. But the thing to be careful about is don't overwork them, because there are some veterans that are not going to say no. And so it's very important to allow them to be a part of it. It's also important to monitor that they don't become somebody who is being preyed upon, not intentionally, but simply because they're always willing to step up and say, hey, let me give a hand. Nancy, you have anything to add here? And you're muted.
Yep. I really appreciate your opening points and the ongoing ways in which military service can shape a veteran's life, and in fact, shape a family of veterans' lives, and being attentive to that while also recognizing that veterans bring enormous gifts and often volunteer to use them in their communities and in their faith communities. And I look forward to ways in which you and I will be able to expand on that. Mm-hmm. So I think what you've begun with by forwarding or foregrounding the strengths of veterans is an important kind of additional reminder, because we hear so much about the challenges that veterans face that we can forget the numerous strengths that they add to our communities.
Fantastic. Thank you. The next thing I want to talk about is how do veterans differ from the general population, not only in terms of the military service, but who decides to serve in the military. As everybody knows, we became an all-volunteer service back in the 1980s. When that happened, there were significant changes in the demographics of those who serve in our military service today. The specific way that I want to identify that this impacts today in terms of how we understand veterans is how many veterans or veterans by and large, through scientific or through statistically valid surveys, have been found to have an increase in the number of adverse childhood experiences that they had compared to the general population. Now, when I say adverse childhood experiences, that's not simply being sexually abused. It includes living with somebody who was in jail, living with a person who abused alcohol or drugs, being a child in a home that was divided, being physically or verbally abused, as well as being sexually abused, 11 different categories that are typically used. As surveys have been done of folks who served after 1973, when the draft ended, the percentage of those who serve in the military who have experienced 4 or more of these ACEs in their early life is 46%. Now that's incredible when you think about it. The folks who are volunteering to serve in our nation today are people who have experienced in their life before they serve significant trauma is what it amounts to. And then further studies have indicated, when they've looked at veterans and those who are suffering from moral injury, post-traumatic stress, or other sorts of things, they find that there is a multiplication effect in terms of these adverse childhood experiences, to where the combined part can very easily then lead to a more severe situation. I bring that up not because I'm trying to be a psychologist here, but rather in terms of when a pastor is looking at a congregation, when a pastor finds that they have a military member, a veteran in their midst, to be aware of the fact that this person's background could be one that didn't just start with trauma in the military, but something that they have experienced through their life. And it means then that as we wrap our arms around them as people of faith, that we may find that there's a whole lot more under the surface than what there is somebody else who's in the congregation that grew up in the community of faith that never had to go through some of these things. One of the things that we very much encourage congregations to do is to practice a radical welcome to anybody who walks through the door if they want to be a military-friendly congregation. The people who come in may not be like those who are sitting in pews already. They may not know how to act. They may have never been there before. But what they are individuals created in the image of God who truly deserve the love and respect that everybody else does. And it could be that they need to be loved and accepted just a little bit more, simply because of what they've been through to get to this point in their lives. Now, the next thing I wanted to emphasize is that the role of clergy in terms of providing resources to veterans has been proven to be very helpful. We all know that we live in a nation that is becoming increasingly characterized by lack of religious affiliation. The number of folks that are going into the military that register no religious preference, probably 40% or above at this point, unlike what it's been in previous eras, previous generations. And it's not changing for the better from the standpoint of somebody who's a pastor. And so why then is it that if these folks have no religious background, is it that clergy can be so important to them? I think one of the reasons for that is because what they find, and for folks that have not been in the military, sometimes don't realize this, that chaplains in the military are the only safe person for individuals to talk to when there's a personal problem. Just recently, the Secretary of the Navy came out with a new instruction on confidentiality and privileged communication and emphasized even more, strengthened the role that chaplains have in terms of being a steam release, if you will. An individual in the military can always go and talk to the chaplain. The chaplain does not own the conversation, the individual does. And the chaplain is not a required reporter. And some people say, well, if they're thinking about doing this or that, why would they not have to report? Well, the reason being, you're in a total institution. They have to have somebody they can talk to. And so chaplains then, whether or not the person has any religious background, can become and often is a very significant person in that individual's life during their military service. Through that, individuals who then come out into the civilian setting oftentimes will find that a clergy person is somebody they can go to when they are experiencing difficulties, because they have also seen the stigma that's associated with seeking psychiatric or psychological help. And so it is a means for them to enter into getting help that is safe and can be something that they're more willing to do, as opposed to seeking more traditional sources. The other thing that we find is that a lot of veterans, when they come out of the service, have come from rural areas and they go back to rural areas. And so in rural areas, there is much more of a paucity of help through mental health services. And again, sometimes the clergy are the only people that are available. It's very important for leaders of congregation, leaders of faith community, to be open to what comes to them. And sometimes, if that individual opens up, to be aware of some of the absolutely tragic and very damning circumstances that the person's been in. that the clergy person themselves may have never experienced because they didn't realize that life could be that bad. Our leaders, our professional religious people in the communities can be a great resource to our veterans as well as to their families as they go through trying to make sense out of a world that they have seen being so very, very brutal in terms of human life. Nancy?
Thanks, Lyman. I want to add a couple of things to what you said, and starting with your focus on rural context, and kind of blend in then. I completely agree that it gets more complicated to find mental health resources often in rural areas. Because everybody knows everybody, it can also be complicated to hope for anonymity in seeking help. And I also want to remind folks that the families of veterans may also need assistance. So one of the things that I'm going to ask Sam to post for a moment to show is the resource from mental health and chaplaincy services. That's a resource of the Veterans Administration, which has extraordinary video resources, both for religious leaders to use with chaplains and with their families. These are free for you. And Sam, if you can, if there's another slide that goes with that.
Yeah, that's it.
You can find a link for faith communities, and then further down that same link, you can find resources for clergy. And these are non-sectarian resources. I've seen these. I really want to commend them to you. And I want to assure you that when this webinar is posted on our site, the link to this will also be with it so that you can find it if you aren't able to copy it down just now. But I wanted to commend those to you. Thank you, Sam. I also maybe you can build a little bit, Lyman, on the importance of recognizing that there are real differences in generations of veterans in our congregations. And as we prepared, Lyman and I talked about the fact that sometimes veterans are able to keep to themselves experiences of moral injury they may have experienced, say, in the Korean War, or many of them in Vietnam. But as they get older, the ability to hold that pain back may diminish. And it's important then to realize that might be the first time family members have also heard some of these stories. And I encourage you to, as you are present with older veterans and their families, to be alert to this. And for some of us, we may be visiting veterans of this age in retirement communities. So you might also be talking with, if those communities have chaplains, talking with them. But there are certainly those. So these resources from the mental health and resources from the VA that we just showed might also be helpful there. But it can come as a surprise to families to hear these stories for the first time, even though they may make sense of behaviors that they didn't quite understand before. So that's another issue. And I think the other thing that I would want to mention is that many of these veterans bring remarkable strengths, and being alert to ways in which they can be contributors to not only the life of a faith community, but to the life of the community in which they are, to bring the skills that they developed in their service to those communities. Unfortunately, it's also the case that, as Lyman was mentioning, that the rate of suicide continues to be significant. And in fact, there are now more suicides on military bases for non-combat active duty military than there were during recent wars, recent conflicts. And these do seem to be traceable in a number of instances to experiences of military sexual trauma or other kinds of trauma that occur on the bases. So while this might come as a surprise to those of us that are civilians, despite the best efforts, there are real challenges on military bases, and this goes across all of our military branches. So I encourage you to be attentive to the experiences of receptive moral injury. That is, veterans who come out and may be the survivor of military sexual trauma, for example, and sometimes that's blended with racism as well, who may not easily begin to talk about that with a religious leader. But if they sense your knowledge about that, and or at least your openness to the conversation, that may be something that they will also be able to share with you. And you can imagine the complications that those experiences might create in families. This is one of the reasons why I mentioned the value of the Beyond the Battlefield service that Holman United Methodist Church offers. And you can go to the link on that service at the website of Holman United Methodist Church. But there are also a number of resources on these issues already at our Brite website from previous webinars. But I do think those are significant issues, and I think that well, I mean, you may be planning to speak about this in a moment, but it's also important to think about the veterans in our congregations or active duty that may be in the reserves and thus leave for a month at a time or more for training, and to be attentive to practices that support their families. Because sometimes that may mean that a spouse is at home with young children without a partner to assist him or her. And developing strategies within a congregation that are sensitive to those needs is an important resource. You probably will say more about that, Lyman, but I do want to mention that veteran-friendly faith communities need to have a wider lens than the veteran, him or herself, and be mindful of the family system in which they may be participating.
Very much so. Thanks, Nancy. And yeah, we're going to talk more about some of those strategies in terms of involving the entire congregation and being aware of what you just said, that a military member doesn't live in isolation. And the impact is not sometimes just on the immediate family, but it can be on the members of the family that are beyond that immediate circle. It's amazing. There was one time, I forget what level grade it was, but a teacher who decided to go ahead and do some studies. And so as she had different classes, she began to have people identify in your life, is there a military member who's had an impact? And sometimes it wasn't an immediate generation, but rather it went back 2 or 3. And as it turned out, there are very few families in the United States who, when they start thinking through the impact that a military member has had in their life, it's there. We have a very small percentage of our population that are actually veterans. Their impact, because of that family connectedness, is much greater than what we sometimes realize. And so as a result, ministry at the congregational level can take that into account and begin to see how it is that this incorporates into what our larger purpose is. Absolutely. And the other point I'd respond back to in terms of what you were saying, Nancy, is how it would seem that sometimes veterans are able to keep within some of the burdens that they bear. And as they then become more senior, what a great time it is for them to begin to experience a release. I've related several people. I was on the island of Okinawa serving actively with the Marine Corps Division there during the 50th anniversary of the celebration of the Battle of Okinawa. we had the distinct privilege of hosting veterans of that battle from both the United States and its allies, as well as those from Japan. The first thing that we did when they both came to the island, and now we're talking about some pretty old folks and some pretty hot temperatures who had a lot of good medical assist, and it was needed, but took them down to the Peace Park where there's a huge big pavilion and had a joint worship type service. Obviously, it was not Christian, it wasn't Shinto, it was, to get together. And for me to stand there as an actively serving military and look at how both of these sets of veterans who had not seen each other since the terrible, terrible bloody battle were able to breathe sometimes in a way that they hadn't breathed for 50 years because they got to see the other person as a person and not as this horrible, vile thing that was trying to kill them. And that happens. It happens in our VA systems. Some of the VA chaplains that I've worked with who are not veterans have been amazed when they get to know a veteran in the system and are open to them, the sorts of things that they're willing to share simply because they need to talk. Pastors, other members of church leadership can certainly develop some of those listening skills as well. Moving on then, what I try to do is talk about veterans, who they are, what are some of the distinct characteristics, the connection to their families, and then the reason why clergy are so important in terms of helping us to care for the veterans in our midst. But clergy are not left alone in terms of having resources. And here, the Department of Veterans Affairs is a huge, huge, huge big resource. Nancy's already shared one of the things that the Department of Veterans Affairs has made available, and these videos are incredible. But one of the key things that the VA has done is through their rural health program, they have funded chaplains to go out and be involved in communities. This last year, every single VA hospital, the chaplain department, was asked to have at least one clergy reach out session in which they would have clergy from the community, whether it be a city, a town, a rural area, to be able to come together, to be able to learn more about what the VA does, as well as then to establish connections. There have been some ongoing types of things that were tried. And I'm going to relate some of the things that they did down in the southeast in the Arkansas area. They had a long-term project there. And in that project, they actually went out and partnered with clergy to set up serving meals for reservists, as Nancy said one time. They went out and they did breakfast for folks. They did community gatherings. They helped with collection of items that then could be supported. They brought together clergy who would not otherwise ever be in the same room with each other simply because they had no reason to be, and had them sit down and talk. And basically what they did was try to build a community that did not exist. But even more than that, what they also tried to do is to help those who are leaders in our faith communities understand who the VA is and how it works. Not that long ago, about 3 years ago now, the role of the VA chaplain in the VA changed dramatically. Prior to that period of time, chaplains were considered to be administrative personnel. And so as a result, they're probably a part of the overhead that the leadership of the VA had to take simply because it was a good thing. That all changed when chaplains became designated as clinical personnel. So through COVID, chaplains are now part of the care team. They enter into notes into the medical record. They are part of the people who are taking care of the chaplains. They're not, or the veterans. They're not there just to do religious services on Sunday or to, pray with somebody when they're having a hard time. They're intimately involved. And in so doing, if clergy and others in communities of faith can understand that, they can begin to see the partnership and the value that there is. And for the most part, I can't speak for every VA chaplain, but the VA chaplains that I've known and worked with, they really do value having that kind of support system. knowing that when a veteran goes back home, that there may be extraordinary needs. As you know, the Department of Veterans Affairs has some incredible programs in terms of caregivers and helping family members that are caregivers. We need to do more. That's always a project in Congress. But they also then want to make sure that that veteran is within a community setting where they're going to be able to get the kind of spiritual care, the listening that's necessary, the acceptance. And so they're always willing to do that. If a clergy person is looking at this and they've heard how bad a situation the VA is in, how people go there and they can't get appointments and they die, the VA is an incredible system, and the vast majority has one of the highest ratings of any medical system in the United States, if not the highest, have more sophisticated ways of doing things, has incredible staff. One time there was a figure that was like in the 60 to 70% of how many of our medical professionals have gotten some of their training out of VA. It's incredible. It's a world-class system. And sometimes, unfortunately, people get the impression that it's not a good place to be. Our veterans need to be there. When you look at the suicide rates among veterans, the number of suicides that are committed by veterans who are not attached to the VA getting care is in the 80 to 90%. And the VA is constantly looking at how they can get more veterans involved. If you're a leader of a faith community and you have a veteran who's struggling, one of the best things to do is to get them involved with the VA if they have not been. Now, it's relatively easy to do that, to find a chaplains. Before we started, I went to, all I did was type into Google, Department of Veterans Affairs, Chaplain Center, brings up their front page. On that front page, there's a link. You click on the link, you put in your zip code, and it actually identifies the chaplains by name who are the closest to you. Incredible resource. You don't have to dig through anything. There they are. And for the most part, they're going to want to work and to help. The other thing that I'll mention is not only are the chaplains there, but the Department of Veterans Affairs has another department. It's Department of Community or Faith-Based Organizations and Community Outreach, separate completely. I looked at it, they've done 5 webinars this month. In fact, they're doing one as I speak, training clergy in ASSIST, which is how to be involved to prevent suicides. They put on more programs and have more resources available than one might expect. And they're very, very dedicated to reaching out. So as a result, as clergy are so important in terms of helping our veterans and their families, military members and their families in our communities, the VA is an incredible resource for congregations in terms of that partnering. And so we highly encourage that. And if there are any questions of how to do it, if I can get a hold of that question, I will certainly try to get you connected in a way that's meaningful. Nancy, anything at this point from you?
I certainly want to support what you've indicated about the usefulness and reaching out to the VA. And that's certainly been our experience here at the center in involving VA chaplains in a number of our webinars. And I also want to underscore what you said about the strengths that veterans bring. I was thinking about Zachary Moon's book, Coming Home, and the way in which Dr. Moon writes about, I'm trying to find the subtitle for that book, but it takes an approach. He is himself a veteran and reserve chaplain, and as well as a professor of pastoral care. And he is underscoring the ways in which veterans bring strengths. So I also encourage you to look at that resource. But one of the things that several folks have written about is also probably something that you're going to move toward in a moment, Lyman, which has to do with encouraging veterans to get together. The ways in which congregations, various faith communities, Jewish, Christian, Muslim, and maybe and public groups, that this becomes this is an opportunity for veterans to be resources to one another, and to encourage each other, to learn from each other, and to share in a space that may feel safer, to be honest at a degree, at a level they might not otherwise, about their experience, and also to experience support from one another. You may want to elaborate on that, Lyman, but I think it's important. And just to go back for a moment to Zachary Moon, part of what he picks up on is the ways in which veterans bring so many skills that they add, that they learn in the service, that can be real resources for a community. And we know stories of veterans that together respond. I'm sure there were a number of veteran groups in Florida after the hurricane decimated so many persons' houses, and in Kentucky after the flood. These are skills that they've learned, and the satisfaction of serving in important ways fellow citizens is something that is important to many veterans.
Thanks. And so as we get towards the end of our hour here, the last thing that I really wanted to talk about was, how do you make a veteran military friendly congregation? And it's very important to do so. We do have a pamphlet that I prepared when I was with the Military Chaplain Association. We still have it available. And I'm hoping that by the time this webinar is posted, we're going to be able to have it on the website. I won't say that it is an incredibly beautiful thing, but I think it is practical in that it provides some basic guidelines. And we continue then to have congregations join what we call our Veteran Military Friendly Congregation Ministry. We'd love to see it expand. I think there's a great role for it, and we're figuring out how we can do a better job of resourcing it so it can get out there. But just talk a little bit of, if you're a member of a faith community and you want to take care of veterans and military members and families in your community, how do you become a veteran military friendly congregation? First thing is to be intentional. Take a look around, see what you need to do. One of the things that we have found is that the pastor, the leader, whoever that is, cannot be the head of this ministry. That individual has too many responsibilities. And if that person wants to be the head of it, chances are it's going to fail. The best thing to do is to find a person, 2 or 3 people in the congregation that can be the key people that will head up this ministry. The very next thing after you do that is to find your core team. They don't need to be veterans necessarily. They need to be people who have a heart for the ministry. And to put that core team together and empower them to make agendas and plans, working with the established leadership, but empowering them to take a look and see what it is that we need to do in order to be a community of faith that is radically welcoming to the veterans and the military members in our midst. That core team then begins to develop their agenda. One of the first things that they need to do is to survey and find out who in their midst, or who has family members that are veterans, that are military members, which families do have military connections. Find some, see if you've got a Gold Star family in your midst, somebody's experienced a loss in her family. Blue Star families who, brothers and sisters, others who are connected, that the family unit itself has an interest in this. There was a time just a few years ago, the chapel at Fort Myer, which is where the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff lives, to give you an idea of how central it is in Washington, D.C., they at a congregational worship service asked people who were veterans to stand up. And lo and behold, they had veterans in their midst that they didn't even know they were veterans. If you don't know who the veterans are in your congregation, you're not alone. It's amazing sometimes to find out. And as Nancy indicated, sometimes folks from previous conflicts have not wanted to deal with that. And yet, at the same time, to be recognized and to be appreciated in the right way can be very meaningful to them. So that's the first thing. Find out who they are. Find out what their needs are. one of the key things, we've already mentioned it, you may have some military families who are living there whose military member is not there. Or, as Nancy already said, the reservists and the National Guard folks, not just chaplains, but all who serve. Practically every community in the United States has people who are serving that may be subject to being sent away for 3 days to a month with very, very little notice. And once they're gone, that spouse that remains, the children that remain, may not have the resources. Find out who they are and get to know them. Don't assume, again, that they're broken. Don't assume that they need anything special. They're great people. Figure out what it is that they would appreciate. Let them tell you by asking versus thinking, well, we know. The next thing is be willing to advertise in your publications, in your weekly announcements, in your Facebook page, what other social media. Go ahead and put in there, join, come to the MCA, Military Chaplain Association, find us online, get designated as a veteran military friendly congregation, and then put that into your advertising so that when somebody comes through the front door, if it's a veteran, a military member, they'll see that sign and they'll realize, okay, these folks really know that I exist and they want me to be here. And then when they come in, make sure that they are welcomed in the way that they should be. Develop a particular prayer list and then use it as you go through the day. Make sure that they're included. One of the worst things I think that a congregation can do is to have a blowout program on Veterans Day where they recognize veterans and then they don't mention them for the rest of the year. No, that's not how it works. Figure out how it is that you can incorporate ministry to veterans into the rest of the ministry that's going on. In fact, sometimes there's a program or ministry that is already there that can be dedicated to the veterans and military members. As Nancy already said, there are some of the larger congregations that even have corporations that are doing specific things. Include that as part of it. Think about special days. I'm not sure how many of you are aware of it, but this past Sunday, the Sunday before Thanksgiving, is a Sunday that is specifically designated for survivors of or families who have had suicides and the loss that they have sustained. One of our Army installations in Rock Island, Illinois, had a very special service. Think of other events where trauma is part of it. We all know about, the blue services prior to Christmas, but think about how sometimes there are special things that have happened and maybe have impacted your community more than others. Around 9/11, for example, Pearl Harbor's coming up. I think it's, 87 years. I wrote it down this morning, I forget. But let's not be afraid to mention how some of these things have formed the fabric of our nation and then to honor those who served in those times. The other thing, I was talking to somebody the other day and they said, well, as the military in Europe with everything that's going on in the Ukraine, I said, we have more military members in Europe right now than what we've had in years. And some of them have been there for months on end. We're not publicizing it. There's good reasons why we're not. But at the same time, how many more congregations have people that are affected because their military member has been sent away and they're not sure when they're going to get home? These are things that a congregation can be aware of. Don't dwell on them. Don't feel sorry for the person. Lift them up, make them part of the community. And so we've got like 7 different programs in this pamphlet. I'm not going to go through them. Low cost things that can be done that will certainly help. The other thing that I'd want to stress is how a congregation can be so helpful by becoming involved in the community. There's a couple of incredible places in our nation where there are some very, very rigorous veteran support programs. And the reason that they're vigorous and they're successful is because they have successfully brought together different helping agencies to form a network. And that is rural congregations, substance abuse treatment centers, veterans courts, military service organizations, veteran service organizations, Vietnam Veterans of America, IAVA for the younger veterans, those sorts of things, as well as then had the congregations begin to cross party lines, if you will, to where these groups that are supporting veterans are having regular meetings and learning from each other. And what that does is it creates a network in which a veteran who's having problems doesn't slip through the so-called safety net. There's one case in particular that an individual related to me. They had a veteran who had been involved in some illegal activity and was rightfully arrested and was going to go to court. They found out that this individual was a veteran, that the individual was suffering from traumatic stress, had been diagnosed that way at the VA, and so had issues. They were able to intervene. The veteran court in that particular area had just been set up less than a year before because of the actions of the folks that were there. The veteran went to the veterans court. Judge held the individual accountable, but said, because of this, I will release you. They had that individual in a treatment center that very night going through substance abuse treatment that they hadn't been able to access before. They had counselors lined up for them. And within basically a matter of 2 or 3 months, the individual's life was turned around because the entire community was able to get together and work. Congregational leaders can be vital in terms of helping people understand this working together. And again, getting back to something that Nancy mentioned, veteran service organizations, military service organizations can be critical in terms of veterans having access to others that they can get together. It's not a matter of a place to go and do nothing but smoke and drink. It's a matter of supporting, sometimes intergenerational, as well as then dealing with folks that when you mention something that's happened, they understand because they've been there. It can be incredibly powerful, and it may be a resource that they don't necessarily reach out to unless encouraged and assured that it's a friendly place to be. And it doesn't always have to be serious. Make it fun as well. Think about some of the activities that they can put on at holidays and things and having the veterans included. The final thing I'll say in terms of our formal presentation time here, there are some incredible organizations that are also helpful to families that clergy can know about. One of those is the National Military Families Association. They have a great website. They have programs all over the country, NMFA. You can look it up. And if you have military families, they get real help through this organization. I know some of the people are there. I hear them talk about some of the issues that families bring to them. And then I see them take off in order to try to resolve those issues in order to make sure they're taken care of. The other organization to know about is TAPS, Tragic Assistance. I'd have to look it up and see. But what they are is they're a resource for folks who have in their families experienced a tragic loss. And so they have special services that are available in order to help people through it. They work with other providers if there's needs for transportation and things like that. And then they have the way of hosting gatherings and bringing people together that have experienced loss. And it's not just the immediate spouse or parents, but rather dealing with it as a family system. The individual who founded it has done an incredible job, has brought in very important people to help, has lined up a lot of corporate sponsorship because they understand. And so clergy members, don't be afraid of thinking in terms of some of these organizations. They are not religious in nature, but they are incredibly powerful in terms of helping our veterans, our military members. And I said that would be the final. The other thing that, Nancy, I'm going to reemphasize it. You have military members living in your community. They're members of the Reserve, the National Guard. The other thing to be aware of is the Civil Air Patrol and the fact that even though it's not a armed service, it is uniform. And there are some real good opportunities there for people that are involved and have that to be involved. And there are Civil Air Patrol chaplains who then are able to gain access to and have a ministry that a lot of folks don't even know about. Don't be afraid to investigate Civil Air Patrol as a member of the clergy or a member of professional military religious people, and figure out how that might lead to entree into some of these other organizations and make it a part of the ministry taking care of the community. Thank you. Unmute, Nancy.
Lyman, I appreciate so much what you've shared, and I may prompt some other thoughts. At the moment, we don't have questions, so we get to continue. And I wanted to pick up one of the ways that a congregation, or maybe a couple of congregations or more, can come together in ways that are at once supportive and might be supportive in ways that are responsive to pain, but of a veteran, but might also be supportive in terms of giving that person a new outlet for an opportunity to be with other veterans, which is often something that veterans appreciate. And that is to think about writing groups. A number, it's demonstrated well now that supporting groups of veterans, congregations there's an interfaith veterans group that presented a year ago this month for the Soul Repair Center, and you can find that conversation at our website. There are also a number of congregations or veterans, sometimes sponsored by congregations, that have formed writing groups. And this doesn't mean that somebody's coming in to write stories of their deepest challenges while serving in the military. On the other hand, it does become a location where a number of veterans have found it helpful to get to know each other, and maybe they begin writing short stories, a variety of things, but it's something that has proved helpful across the country. So I commend it to you, and you're welcome to come to our site and look up last November and also last April of 2022. We had a whole webinar focusing on this, and where veterans have came together to form these writing groups. And it's both an opportunity for self-expression and an opportunity for camaraderie, because around as trust is deepened, then the topics of what is written about might differ. And somebody might choose to write about their experience in the service, and it might just be something else, but they're forming an increasingly intimate and warm tie with other veterans, finding one another, and that has often proven useful to veterans. There's also a chapter on writing groups in a book that Carrie Doring and I co-edited called Military Moral Injury and Spiritual Care. And I encourage you to look at that chapter by Sean Fawson. So I mentioned writing groups as a safe place. Shelley Rambo also writes about this in her remarkable book, Resurrecting Wounds, where one of the chapters is about a congregation that hosts a writing group where the intimacy for the veterans supporting one another is clear. And this happens in a number of cases. I also wanted to pick up something that Lyman mentioned regarding the number of persons who reservists or active duty that find themselves on the eastern borders of Europe and may well be there through the holy days of certainly Jewish and Christian faiths. And think about ways in which the families of those who are missing their military member might be especially helped by congregations responding to that the kind of void that person's absence creates. So, that's another particular thing to remember, I believe, about walking beside military families when a member of that family is away. So, and especially when they're not quite sure when they'll be back, and they know that the situation for their deployment might change. So it can be a challenging moment, and I think that's something that any faith community might do well to remember, or would do well to remember in these times. Lyman, you may want to build on either of those things, like about writing groups or the absence of a family member in service during this challenging moment in our history.
Yeah, first, the writing groups. One of the things that we do emphasize in the pamphlet I mentioned is the writing groups. And then we have some other ideas in there on how folks can be brought together. And as we've probably seen, and as Nancy was indicating, veterans and military members sometimes have incredible skills, but they also can have outlets in terms of artistic endeavors and that sort of thing. So not just writing. One of our chaplains is very much involved in terms of getting Vietnam veterans off the streets, and her therapy includes art therapy. Because through expressing themselves through a medium that they never thought that they could explore, they have found some great relief in terms of the pain and the bitterness and the overwhelming grief that remains inside. So there are some very good things that can happen, and sometimes surprising, to where a congregational leader shouldn't be reluctant to sometimes bring up some things that seem out of the box. May be surprising how much folks will respond to it. Another thing that I'll mention that we have gone over is, as our military becomes more and more technocentric, there are more and more of our military members that are experiencing major trauma without actually being deployed into a field of combat. We have folks that are working behind the wire every day, who are flying drones, who are watching through cameras. We have people that every day go in and search in the dark web, looking for terrorist networks and connections, lots of which are buried inside pornographic material that you would never want to see. And they're exposed to that. And then when their shift gets over, they go home, and they may then take their child to a baseball game or something. It's no longer a world in which somebody who is not in the forward field of battle is not involved in the battle. And that is happening on an increasingly frequent basis. Sometimes, again, we're just not aware of some of the stress that folks have, even though they may go home at night and spend time with their families. And so again, congregational leaders having an awareness of what may be the case, even though they can't see it, even though they can't talk about it, but at the same time being sensitive and ensuring then that they know that they're cared for, that if a mistake happens, that they're still going to be loved and accepted, and that they are not going to be judged for who they are, but rather they are going to be supported as they seek to be better people going forward, and seek to sometimes deal with things that other people in the congregation may not have to deal with. There's a lot of depth in terms of having a military ministry, and that's where working alongside others is very, very important in order to be successful, to take care of these brave men and women who are sacrificing so much, not just to ensure the safety of the United States, but to seek to bring justice and liberty where we go. So thank you very much for considering that.
Lyman, one thing that because we don't have a question, I'm checking in with Kyle to see if from his experience he has things he wants to add to this conversation. But I wanted to mention that last spring, I think maybe April, we had a webinar related to unhoused veterans.
Mhm.
I use that term rather than homeless.
Mhm.
And one of the participants on that panel was a chaplain in a shelter for unhoused people. Another is a former employee of the Volunteers of America and now has a practice as a marriage and family therapist. One of the sobering things that she shared was that there was a high correlation between veterans who'd experienced military sexual trauma and being unhoused. So the chaplain that was new to the idea of moral injury, working in this large shelter in Fort Worth, actually, was reading quickly about moral injury and then had a conversation with one of the folks staying at the shelter. And sure enough, simply indicating that he was doing this and was increasingly aware of some of the issues for veterans, this person shared with him that that was his experience. So I bring this up not to say that every unhoused veteran has had this experience, but rather to be aware that we hadn't talked so much about unhoused folks, and it does happen, and that there could be a range of experiences that contribute to somebody having a difficulty re-entering civilian life after military experience that may or may not have to do with having had active duty service. But you can imagine the challenge then of experiencing somebody who you are taught to imagine as a comrade, and each of you would have each other's backs and have that experience. So I add that to our reflection because many congregations have outreach to unhoused folks. And at least, without assuming that everyone has that experience, at least be sensitive to the ways in which military service may be a part of the story that leads to that person being unhoused at this point. And also be respectful for the fact that they did serve our country as a member of our military. You may want to speak to that issue of military service and some challenges that veterans have leaving the service, Lyman.
Mhm. The transition from service to civilian community can be and often is a difficult one. Not too long ago, the person who was the immediately preceding chief of VA chaplains was challenged to figure out how do we do a better job. One of the things that they were trying to do, it didn't really prove successful because the magnitude of logistics were too great, but to have military chaplains actually then talk with every person that's leaving the military and seeking to have them immediately contact the VA and establish their health benefits and those sorts of things. And the reason that chaplains were involved was because it was, again, the trust factor that they've heard so many negative things that sometimes they need somebody that they trust to say something positive. That has been one of the more difficult things in terms of folks who are leaving the military, sometimes with a perfect record, but at the same time, as Nancy indicated, having experienced a trauma of some kind, whether it be sexual assault or some other sort of trauma. They then, if they don't make contact, if they don't come under that care, it's very easy for them then to slip away. The other one that I've encountered, and maybe it happens more often than what we think, is that there are people that enter the military, they make it through basic training, and then at some point prior to the end of their enlistment, they leave the military, oftentimes under bad circumstances. More than likely, they weren't cut out to be in the military. Sometimes they have fallen under the wrong guidance, and oftentimes they did something stupid. When that happens and they're still part of a unit, the unit tends to shun them. And the unit does that for a very good reason, in that they have broken the faith. They're no longer part of the band, if you will. I mean, to use the term that's polite, is they're a dirtbag, and and the military sometimes needs to do that because of the high reliance that they have on their own support of one another, and this individual didn't do it. That person needs to be able to come from the military and re-enter civilian life and still be a good citizen. And so trying to support them through what can sometimes be an incredibly long process, when they have nothing to do each day and they have nobody who's their friend, is incredibly difficult, and it's very, very important.
Right.
You may, and again, congregational leaders may have an individual who in their community graduated from high school, did a great job, joined the military, was going to do great things, and suddenly a year and a half later, you see that person back in town. Reach out, find out who that is, restore them. The fact they didn't make it in the military doesn't mean that they're an evil person, but they sometimes the military is that which they seek in order to be able to become something. And when they fail there, there's nothing left.
Right.
And that's where the sensitivity of our faith community leaders to know who the people are. And sometimes those people aren't going to be members of congregations. And in fact, as we know today, vast majority aren't. How do we know them in the community to know that at that point they need the love and acceptance that sometimes only a person of faith can offer? And that's something else that military, veteran-friendly congregations can make it a point to figure out how to interact, to know who these people are, that when they come home, they're getting the support that they need. So just another thought.
Yeah, Lyman, we do have a question, and
Yeah.
it has to do with asking for us to return to something we talked about only briefly before, that since half of our 18 million veterans are over 65, what particular suggestions do we have for ministry and support to that demographic? There may be things you want to add to that, to what we said before, or to reiterate. I'll do the same, but you're welcome to lead off.
Very good question, and good thing. And as we said, sometimes it's as veterans enter into more senior times that the need to be open and talk about things is extremely important. The conversation groups that Nancy already has talked about, I think, are very, very important, writing groups and so on. The other thing is that lots of times then, because of their service, kind of where they serve, they're also carrying some medical needs that would not necessarily be present otherwise, or they get inflamed, they get worse. Number one thing is to have them involved in the Department of Veterans Affairs, to have them seen regularly on a consistent basis, a treatment provider from the VA who understands much more so than what the typical civilian doctor does, the complex of issues that can be there in the life. I think support, if a congregation has a parish nurse of some sort, what a great deal in terms of arranging for that kind of ongoing care. And then to help the family of that veteran to know what resources are available. An awful lot of families have never taken the time to figure out, not only at the Department of Veterans Affairs level, but also within states. Every state has its own Department of Veterans Affairs. And sometimes those state resources are more than what is available through the federal government. And so develop those resources. And then again, going back to the various VSOs and MSOs, the Disabled American Veterans are present almost across the United States. They understand, they know what the resources are. They can help and give good advice. So yeah, it can be a very tragic circumstance. I had a cousin who served in Korea, had a Purple Heart. I served in World War II and Korea, older than me, I guess, had a Purple Heart. He ended up 4 years in a VA nursing home because he had no other resources, and they cared for him. And we were so grateful that he had a place to be with others, and was able to die peacefully and in comfort, as opposed to not having anything. Make sure that we're using the resources that are available.
I want to pick up a little bit to that question, which I really appreciate and glad to come back to it, and think about the position of a parish clergy in any religious tradition, and be attentive to whether you know who the veterans are in a congregation, and look for opportunities to be in conversation, to know more about what their service was, and whether there'd be interest in arranging, depending on the age, but certainly folks in their 60s and 70s may well be able, for sure, to meet after services or in some other context, and invite conversation about the ways in which what their experience was like that they wish to share in that at least initial conversation. And if they know who each other is that are veterans, they might well, but an opportunity to reflect back about how that shaped their lives. And also be attentive to the spouses if they are in such committed relationships, and listen for ways that they reflect on it, which could be different, because it may not be a conversation that they've had together, but when you invite the conversation, there may be ways they learn from each other. I remember when Dr. Brock came to Brite and had just written her book related to moral injury, and the term was new for all of us, that one of the things that we realized was that this term had power that to more than one generation. And I was at a conference then shortly after where there were a number of military chaplains, and I happened to be standing near a group of them, and I just asked them what they thought about the term, and it was new to them. And so I briefly described it, and each of the three men said, "That explains my father," which was, really got my attention. And what that reminded me of, because I was a pastor before I prepared to teach, was paying attention to the ways military service shapes a family system. And one of the privileges of working in congregational settings in any tradition is that you're working with family systems. And so not only am I, encouraging, in my experience, religious leaders have a level of access for deep conversations that many others do not. And as one visits with folks that may not be getting outside the home or may now be in retirement communities, there are opportunities to invite folks to reflect on the ways in which military service, how they experience that now. How did it shape their lives? And invite a spouse to be part of that conversation who may have observations that they may never have had that conversation. So I part of what I say is, part of the way I would respond to this if one is in a faith community is to take advantage of access to relationships within a family system, but also the opportunities to invite shared conversation among persons with shared experience. Because as we age, sometimes our ability to come to events might decline. So providing some way of transportation, but some opportunity for sharing, both within the folks who actively served and then also sharing with family members, I think could be very helpful in initiating conversations that might not have happened. The other thing that I'll repeat that Lyman and I both discussed yesterday as we were preparing was being aware that as veterans age, the reserve that they may have kept for dealing with challenging memories of their service may begin to weaken. And it is helpful to be mindful of that if we are privileged to walk beside them toward the end of their life. And to the extent that we can foster conversation prior to the very last days when communication may be difficult, but if we're able to foster conversation within family systems about those experiences, when a veteran might be able to receive support from family that he or she might not have dared to hope for or couldn't and didn't choose to assume, that could be very helpful. And if it's a difficult word they share, then being present to help the family to process that together can also be a privilege for a religious leader. So I really appreciate the question. And in my own family, I know the point about how deeper memories of service may emerge and that very close to the end of a veteran's life, when it's harder to help process that with them. So I hope for those of you who are religious leaders participating in this webinar or watching it later, that you'll be reflective about gently creating opportunities for conversation between veterans and then within family systems of veterans. Now, Lyman, you yourself, a religious leader, there may be things you'd want to add or correct to what I said.
Nancy, I think you did a great job talking about the sensitivity. I think and I'll go back to one thing that I mentioned, is that a veteran military friendly congregation has to have a member of the congregation who leads out and is sensitive in some of those areas. Lots of times a religious leader is unwilling or hesitant, if not unwilling, to turn over that leadership. Mm-hmm. But over and over again, we have seen that it's critical that they do. They can be called in. They can be the pastor when need to be. But to have a committed group within a congregation that is empowered by the congregation, by the leadership, to make decisions and to go forward is the best way to take care of our military families, our military members, and our veterans. Mm-hmm. And so it's a shared responsibility in the community. And sometimes it's not that comfortable to go beyond the walls, because we're much more, as a religious leader, as a pastor, we're a whole lot more comfortable dealing with the people that are inside the walls than what we are trying to figure out how to interact with all these other people that are out there. Mm-hmm. It's incumbent upon us to not be fearful, but to rather trust in our God that will prepare the way so that we can meet the needs of all of the people and not simply those who come through the doors on the particular morning that we worship.
That's a very helpful point. Yesterday, Lyman and I also talked about an experience that a very experienced pastor shared with me, and where a veteran chose to share a long kept and very painful memory from service in Vietnam. And I take it I don't think this would have happened if that veteran hadn't sensed that it was safe enough to say this with that pastor. But fortunately, the pastor was somebody skilled to listen. But I do think that for religious leaders to indicate in prayers, in various ways in conversation that they're informed about military moral injury, does at least perhaps open a door later for someone that had ears to hear and finds the courage to share with someone that they've had heard enough to imagine might be able to understand the difficult memory they want to share. So I also want to underscore the particular position that religious leaders may have, or other members of the congregation that have informed themselves and have demonstrated to a veteran that if they ever wanted to share, this without saying it, but if they ever wanted to talk more about that, they were open to it. So I really, again, I want to say how much I appreciate that conversation, that question that you posed. And we have now come to the end of this long conversation between Lyman and myself. And Lyman, I want to thank you for the information, for the expertise that you've brought, and for your long service in this role of supporting military persons and their families. And to thank the audience that was with us and that will be with us in the future as they watch this webinar. So I appreciate your presence with us and your willingness to be part of a slightly different presentation than we anticipated before today.
Thank you, Nancy. It's been great.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.